Yes. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this panel discussion on the future of case method as a pedagogical tool. We are fortunate to have a very distinguished panel to throw light on this important topic. So on the panel today, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Andrew Jack, who's currently the Global Education Editor at the Financial Times. Andrew will moderate today's event, and actually it was a piece that Andrew had in the Financial Times on the case method that sort of got us thinking about hosting this panel discussion. So Andrew, thank you so much for being here today. We have Dr. John Elias, who is the Director of Case Study Research at the Yale School of Management. He also teaches theater management at the David Geffen School of Drama at Yale. And a very, very accomplished academic. So thank you, Dr. Elias, for being here. Professor V.G. Narayanan, our next panelist, has been an HBS member for more than 20 years. He's the Thomas D. Casserly Junior Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Thank you, Professor Narayan, for joining us. And from IMB, we have our two brightest stars, Professor Srivardhani Jha, who's an Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship here at IIM Bangalore, and Professor Geeta Mitra Desai, who's an Associate Professor of Operations Research in the Decision Sciences Group here at IMB. So welcome all of you, and without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Andrew, and you can take it over from here, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chetan, and welcome to everybody.
Can't hear you, Andrew. I think you're muted.
That's strange. I'm not on mute. You can't hear?
We can hear you.
You can hear. Oh. Hopefully everyone can hear. Just let me know if you can't. But thank you very much, Chetan, and welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to moderate this great high-powered panel, and a pleasure also to hear that a piece I wrote now a couple of years ago on the case method interested you, and indeed still gets a lot of reads on our website. I wrote that piece partly as an exploratory process myself to understand more about the case method, and had the pleasure and the privilege to sit in on some case classes in Harvard as part of that. But I was trying to explore both how its role, how it balances with other forms of pedagogy, and alternative approaches both within and beyond the case method, which of course are becoming ever more relevant as we talk about the spread of business studies around the world, and we adapt both within business schools and more widely in work to a more virtual and blended reality. So we're going to touch on a lot of those themes over the next hour, and I'd encourage those of you who are watching to also post questions and reflections, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. But we're going to begin with our three distinguished panelists talking about their own distinctive perspectives on the case method. And let me start first close to home at IIMB with Srivardhani to hear a little bit about your take on the case method. Over to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Andrew. It's my pleasure to be a part of this esteemed panel. Let me share my screen, and please let me know. Yeah, I hope this is visible to everybody. Okay, great. Good evening, and everyone, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be here today. Over the next 7-8 minutes, I'm just going to give you my take on the future of case method in general. Since I'm also starting it off, I assume everyone here knows what the case method is, but nevertheless, very quickly, case method is a discussion-based pedagogy. It comprises two parts. One is the case itself, and the second is the classroom discussion associated with that case. The case is a narrative, as you all are aware, of an organization, the scenario that's facing the organization, and an impending decision. That's typically how a case is set up. It does not have any analysis or conclusion. It is simply a narrative, a text that provides information. It's the classroom discussion which sort of complements that. That is where the participants analyze, they identify options, evaluate choices, and as well as predict the consequences of various courses of action. And the case method is, of course, very, very popular across disciplines in business, medicine, law, political science, history, linguistics, and so on. So I'm going to start by talking about what I like a lot about the case method, what I think are its unique advantages. Then I'll talk a little bit about the challenges, and then reflect on what we could do, what are some of the approaches we can adopt to enhance learning from the case method. So the first, talking of advantages, it's a flipped classroom, right? So when we are doing a case discussion, the participants prepare ahead of the class. So the class discussion is extremely engaging and energizing, right? The 90 minutes go by without anybody realizing it. So it's an exhilarating experience for the instructor as well as the participants. And unlike in, let us say, a lecture-based classroom where the instructor comes from a position of authority, here the equation is somewhat more equalized. The participants have done their homework, they have reflected on the case, they have done additional research. So they come to the class fully armed with information and reflections. So in a way, the role of the instructor here is really that of a facilitator, right? And the class dynamics are very different in a nice way. It also gives an opportunity for the participants to walk in the protagonist's shoes. This is very, very important, whether it's at an undergrad level or even at an MBA level. There are many students who may not have had an exposure to the corporate world at all. And what the case method does is really, it gives them an opportunity to immerse themselves in the corporate context, which is very, very valuable. And in doing so, it brings out the complexity of decision making, right? And students have to wade through a ton of information and distill what's really relevant for the decision that they need to take. So it kind of really sort of throws them as close to the real world as possible while sitting in the classroom. It facilitates critical thinking, systematic analysis, and decision making. So apart from actually when we are doing a case discussion, in addition to solving that particular problem or arriving at a particular decision, there's always, the second order learning, right? When you do a bunch of cases through your courses, you're developing all of these skills like critical thinking, systematic analysis, and decision making. And it's a fantastic way to uncover and apply concepts. So concepts, frameworks that one has learned through lectures or have picked up through readings and so on. This gives an opportunity to apply those and see how they work. So these are some very, very important advantages in my mind. Now, moving on to challenges. One of the things that I find is that the case method favors extroverts, right? Clearly, participants who are socially comfortable, confident, good communicators tend to do much better in a case discussion as opposed to those who are socially a little shy. And this is something that as instructors, we need to be very aware that there are different learning styles. And in order to have an inclusive class, we need to sort of factor that and keep that in mind. And as much as it helps people to walk in the shoes of the protagonist, it's not always easy to do that. So many times cases may be set in a different time frame. They could be describing things that are happening in a very different culture. And these pose some challenges for the participants to actually walk in the protagonist's shoes, as much as we would like them to do that. And more recently, what's happening is there's too much information. There's a lot of information available online. So in a way, any case that we are discussing, the participants in the class kind of know how that unfolded, what decisions were taken, and what really happened. While that itself doesn't take away too much, it does take away a little bit of the fun of case discussion. And it can also sometimes hijack the discussion and divert it in a different direction. And cases are curated. I mean, the typical case that we talk about is 10 to 15 pages long with a bunch of exhibits and so on. In the real world, the decision making is a lot more messy, right? And for decision makers, separating the noise from the signal is as important as actually being able to process the signal. So while curated cases are good, there is a limited opportunity to do that because a lot of the information is presented in a way that enables that decision making. And again, lately we see that there is a preference for bite-sized content, decreasing attention span. All of these are posing challenges because a 10+ page case requires a good hour or hour and a half of reading and preparation. So there is inherently a change in the preference of learners, and this is something that poses a little bit of a challenge for very lengthy cases. And what I've also found is that the pace of change in the business world somewhat exceeds the rate at which cases are created. And I face this problem, especially when I'm trying to teach something that's emerging. But then this is a challenge that is true for everybody. We need to sort of stay right on top of practice. And as an academic community, we need to be ready to create cases that are very topical, that are looking at the cutting edge of practice. So what are some approaches to enhance learning from cases? My take, again, with the idea of inclusivity and being able to cater to different learning styles, complementing in-class discussion with online forums, etc., could be an interesting way to do that. I also like to intersperse case discussion with role plays, videos, breakout groups, and polls. Breakout groups polls work really well, even in the virtual world. Role plays and videos, again, are interesting tools that will help the participants get into the shoes of the protagonist. They tend to empathize much more with the protagonist through these methods. Video cases and shorter in-class cases work quite well. In fact, I'm quite a fan of the shorter in-class cases. I've used several of them, and they seem to work very well, at least for some type of topics. What I teach, which is entrepreneurship, shorter in-class cases work quite well. But this is not to say that every case should be a short case, but I think over the course of an entire semester or a quarter in a particular course, it's good to have a mix of longer and shorter cases and video cases and so on. And finally, from a learning perspective, complementing cases with lectures, in-class exercises, simulations, and experiential learning projects is a great way to solidify learning. So I'll stop there and back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Srivadeni, and for keeping to time, because obviously we're trying to get through quite a lot in a short time. So very helpful thoughts, and ones that perhaps our other speakers might want to pick up on in their presentations. So let me turn first, though, to VG at Harvard, and I see interesting symbolic 100 years of the case method. Of course, Harvard, well known for its establishing the genre and still with an enormous influence and footprint around the world. So give us, please, your perspective on the case method and its evolving role.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to IIM Bangalore for organizing this. And it is indeed very appropriate that we're doing this on the 100th anniversary of the very first case that was written at HBS in 1921, the General Shoe Company case. And I'm coordinating the centennial celebrations this academic year. And so thank you, IIM Bangalore. Thank you to Andrew for writing the article that sponsored this webinar, and the greetings to the fellow panelists and the participants today. So I'll try not to overlap too much with what Srivadeni said. I would say she stole all my best points, but I'll try not to dwell on those. We very much stole the idea here at HBS from the law schools. I think that's where the immediate origins were. And it's also used at medical schools and history classes. It's ubiquitous. And I would like to claim that this is the original flipped classroom, like Srivardhini said. You read ahead of time, you do textbook chapters, you work out problem sets, you watch videos, you do all that, and even practice some of the case discussion in small groups ahead of time. And what happens in the class is just the discussion, right? So we don't regurgitate case facts in the classroom, we go straight to the analysis. And my first introduction to the case method happened at IIM Ahmedabad, and until then, I was used to a traditional method in India where you take exams at the end of the semester or the end of the year. And like all students, I would start a month before the exams and start cramming for those exams. This case method was my first introduction to continuous learning. Every day you go prepared to class. And it doesn't have to be the case method. You could just have lectures and quizzes every day. But at least for me, that was that introduction of continuous learning and continuous preparation, not sporadic at the end of the semester and burn the midnight oil kind of learning model that I was used to. And in the classroom, students discuss, debate, critically reflect on the issues and nuances in the case, and engagement tends to be high. Because, well, a lot of your grade depends on class participation, but also because there are debates, there's role-playing going on, you're the protagonist, you're the detractor, you're the person that's being acquired, someone else is bidding for you. So different students in the class can take on different roles and, fight it out. And you complement that with polls and surveys in the middle of the class. You show videos. You try and bring the protagonist in the case come to class, either in person or through a video link. And that makes the whole thing more lively. All right. So that's the case method. It hones critical skills. And I would pick up on one or two things here. Like, the important thing here is you're learning how to learn. Every day is a simulation of what you might encounter in the business world. And by the time you've done, 700 cases over 2 years, hopefully you have a good start on how to deal with this in the real world, where there is no professor, where there is no 90 other students in the classroom to help you, but you have a smaller team, but you've learned the core skills here, and you can do that on an ongoing basis, okay? It's meant to partially simulate, and I say partial because you cannot replicate the richness of the real world in a 20-page case. Another added benefit, I would argue, is that your communication skills are better. You're able to work better in groups. You're trying to convince others to take your point of view while simultaneously listening and being open-minded about saying, oh, maybe I could have thought about this differently. That give and take is sort of at the core of the case method. What are we not trying to do? We're not trying to teach case facts, frameworks, theories, best practices, or knowledge directly in the classroom. That happens outside the class, okay? You're not trying to answer student questions or doubts related to the readings. Do that in section, do that in chat rooms. Don't use class method for that, class time for that. You're not working on problem sets, and you cannot substitute for true experiential learning in the field or simulation. It's not any of those. That's not to say that these things like problem sets or answering students' questions or simulations or experiential learning is not valuable. It's extremely valuable. It's just not the case method. So the case method can't be the only way you teach. You've got to complement this with a whole bunch of other ways of learning. Andrew asked me, what are the different types of cases? We use field cases. I put them top of the list because that has, in my mind, highest priority, because it's very difficult to substitute for the real world. Next best for me is library cases. We tend to reserve those for failures, and something really bad happens. No one wants to talk about it. So we tend to use secondary sources like the bankruptcy court proceedings or a lawsuit to get that information right. The third one is armchair cases, where someone says, I've done 20 consulting projects on this topic, so I know enough to write the case. A version of field cases that sometimes blends into armchair cases are disguised cases, where I just wrote a case on a family business. We just replace the names of the company and the protagonists, but otherwise it's a field case approved by the company. The two kinds of cases, the more popular one is decision-oriented, where you have to make a call at the end of the case. But you can also have something which is like particularly for failure cases where you go and say, what went wrong? It's like examining an airplane crash and say, why did we fail? What happened? So you could have reflection cases. This pandemic has brought like live cases to me because I was teaching in Zoom. We brought in protagonists on Zoom and they kind of narrated what they were facing in the middle of the pandemic. So that's a new genre, I guess. What are the limitations? It's extremely inefficient way to transmit information and knowledge. Give me 80 minutes to lecture, I can transfer a lot more content than I can in 80-minute case discussion. But that's sort of missing the point. 80-minute video of my lecture is just as effective as 80-minute lecture in the classroom. So I would rather reserve the classroom time for something more interactive where they're learning critical judgment skills, okay? It does not truly substitute for experiential learning. Students working in group projects, doing consulting projects for companies, that has its own learning where they apply what they learned in the classroom into the real world. I agree with Srivardhini here. It seems to favor extroverted and articulate individuals. We can discuss later how to mitigate that. And this uncertainty, different students take away different things from the same discussion. I think that's okay. I think we have to embrace that. But if you're thinking that it's standardized, we have more work to do. And like I mentioned, this bias towards success stories. Better approaches for the case method. I have less than 30 seconds, so let me be very quick about it. I would say, let go and trust your students, okay? Let them formulate the case. What is the main issue here? Let them come up with the solutions, and you don't have the responsibility to sort of give them the answer for the case and resist the temptation to jump in and correct. If you trust your students, you'll be pleasantly surprised by how good they are, okay? And sort of make yourself redundant in the classroom. Ultimately, that's what you're trying to do is in the real world, you're not around to help your students. So a true measure of success of the case method is how good is the discussion without your involvement and intervention. Let me stop here and thank you very much.
So thanks very much for that that succinct sort of overview, and great to hear about the anniversary. No doubt there'll be lots more to hear about that in the months ahead. But let's now turn to our final speaker, Jan, and great also to hear your background and continued work with drama, because of course in many ways teaching cases is really a very sort of theatrical, dramatic process, isn't it, Jan? So we'd love to hear your views.
It is indeed, and what I teach in drama school is not that exciting. It is how to write cases, because each master's student in the theater management program has to complete a case study. So what I teach them is how to write that case study to complete their master's degree. So I wish it were more exciting in other ways. Let me share my screen here. I'm going to take a slightly different approach than my fellow panelists. They've been very good at making the case for cases and discussing cases. I'm simply going to assume that we're going to continue doing case-based teaching forever. This isn't a profound insight on my part. It's more a bit of job security, because unlike my fellow panelists, if we would stop producing cases, I would lose my job and I'd have to go out and find some honest work. Let me begin with a kind of a non-controversial statement that the goal of professional education, whether in a business school, a law school, a public health school, or a drama school, is that we endeavor to instill in our students both skills and judgment. And by skills here, I mean things like how to calculate it, NPV, how to do a 5 forces analysis, how to conduct a performance evaluation, how to balance a line, an assembly line. By judgment, I mean the bigger questions, sort of like how to select a strategy, hire a CEO, craft a mission. So this is basically what I think that most professional schools would agree to as their kind of mission. However, the teaching requirements for teaching skills and judgment, at least in my experience, has been slightly different. For skills, if you want to teach skills, you have parameters, checklists, formulas, hard numbers. You get the numbers and you figure out how to calculate them. You have right answers. there is a right way to calculate an NPV. There is a right way to balance a line. There is a right way to figure out a cash flow statement. These they're just the right answers. These are the signature skills. Dorothy Leonard Barton at HBS had this idea of signature skills that people have in their jobs. These are signature skills for students coming from an MBA program. This is in their toolkit. So these are very important things to have. People expect when you have an MBA that you know how to do these things. And finally, from a pedagogical perspective, you have measurable progress. You can see if your students are correctly discounting cash flows. You can see if they are choosing the correct hurdle rate and so on. Judgment cases, here we're talking about decision-making under extreme uncertainty. So a lot more they have a lot more options. You have the possibility of hybrid options. Sometimes you have to bring in ideas and concepts from multiple disciplines. You have to deal with unintended consequences and hard to track developments. So I know people out there right now are saying, you need skills to have judgment. You need judgment to appropriately put in the correct skills. But I say I'm a case writer, so creating slightly artificial dichotomous dilemmas is part of what I do. So that's partially why I've set it up like this. The other reason that I've set it up like this is, as a case writer, we face this kind of dichotomy a great deal more. As I've often told my case writers who work for me, cases are for classes. They're not independent literary creations. And so that the way to think about it as a case writer is that you are a script writer for a 90-minute piece of improvisational theater. So you provide all of the stuff, and then the faculty member is the director and the students are the actors in this case study. So we get pushed, and this is something that I've seen over my 15 years here at Yale, constantly get pushed towards creating cases that focus on skills, where you have stylized facts. They're geared to a specific skill. You read the case, you go, what I know, what I have to do at the end of this case is balance this line or construct a net present value calculation. They tend to be shorter, and faculty want a shorter case. Most of the information tends to be in the exhibits, and they're a real blessing for students with limited time. They read the case quickly. They spend most of their time doing a very specific analysis. Judgment cases, a little more difficult to write, larger, they're messy, they're contradictory fact patterns. You have to bring in a great deal of context. They tend to be longer, more detailed, and sometimes we find that students just may skim the case rather than really dig into it. My department was created basically on this dichotomy. The belief was at the time of our dean and myself, both of us HBS graduates, so it was not knocking our mother institution, but it was the feeling that HBS cases were becoming more and more skill cases, that they were becoming shorter, much more geared towards teaching a specific skill. Now, what we started with was we would write much longer cases with a lot more context in them. That was not optimal. Students didn't like when the cases went beyond that magic 15-page limit on case writing. So our next response, and the one that we have been kind of pushing for a while now, is this thing we call raw cases. And the reason we call them raw cases is that in addition to a narrative, we have, we bring in video links, we bring in spreadsheets, we bring in articles, maps, all kinds of things that you could do and look at and enrich the case study in that way and develop more judgment. Here's an opening slide of a case study that happens to be about a company in Bangalore. Selco solar electric company. It's one of the first ones that we did. So the promise of this idea of raw cases was that students would develop judgment by reading cases in an expanded format. They had to use multiple channels, videos, articles, etc., to formulate the ideas. They could work on the skill sets by looking at the expanded access to data, by having this data in the case study. And they would learn to prioritize their research because the case studies were big. You cannot read everything, but because of the format online, you can skip and in fact, write in a nonlinear fashion. So 10 years of doing the case, these raw cases, we've made some discoveries about raw cases. First of all, narrative writers of the world rejoice. Narratives are necessary. Initially, we thought we just put a bunch of stuff up there, the things, and that would be the case study. No, students need a narrative to pull together the case story. So you always need a narrative, even when you are presenting raw materials. The second thing we found is I was worried that if we gave students a PDF of the narrative, they wouldn't read the case study online. They would just download the PDF and read the PDF. And after years of them bugging me to put a PDF version of the text into the case study, we did an A/B analysis of some got the text, some didn't. The good answer to us was that they still wanted to use the online resources. So that was a surprising discovery for me, because I thought they wouldn't once they got the PDF, but they still went to the online resources, watched the videos, and did the spreadsheets. Raw cases, as we found out, work really well for projects and contests. I have a stack of letters from people who have done this in terms of conferences or case contests, and they said, oh, this was the best experience of my MBA career, not just people from Yale, but other places that have done these things. They love it. The downside is faculty have come to me frequently and said, I can't teach the whole case in 90 minutes. There is just too much here. So they have in many ways done their own abridgments of these online cases and created lesson plans that are more skill-based or judgment-based. In other words, for a judgment-based case, they might do some of the skill work for the students. And for some of the more skill-based cases, they say, okay, you've seen the context, let's just talk about this particular thing. So in terms of the remit for this panel, what's the future of case studies? I found that what we're thinking about, at least now, and again, we have not done any of these things, but what we're thinking about is focusing on that arrow between assignment and class. So some of these things have already been alluded to by our panelists, but I think that they can be explored in a more systematic fashion as we go forward. What if a discussion of a case began before a start of class and extended after through instructor moderated social media? The important thing there is it's instructor moderated, so students take it seriously and focus on the classes. But I have seen using Zoom over this pandemic and teaching using Zoom that the chat function is great. As case teachers know, the worst thing is when you have a case study discussion and a student brings up a point that you were going to do 3 or 4 minutes later, or 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, and you have to say, okay, John, let's put a pin in it and come back to it. We're going to discuss this thing first. If you look at Zoom, or if you know what students are doing already on social media, they can, you know what the discussion is, and you can set up your discussion in class a bit better. What if I ask cases were interactive, allowing the students to do a skill-based exercise grounded on the case material, receive instant automated feedback on whether they got it right or wrong, not, and then use this as a basis to go into class where you had a more judgment-based discussion. So rather than just flipping the classroom, this would be kind of building to the classroom, making the classroom the ultimate experience once students have done a number of steps of analysis and have exercised their skill. And then finally, what if instead of doing cases. I remember when I was at HBS, the way they laid out every class was, you know, this is the first session is this case, this is the second session is this case, and third session. So you'd actually lay it out as a series of cases. My question is, what if we, rather than doing discrete case classes, we had cases that kind of spanned a course, allowing for multiple takes on the same material. And so you could discuss things over time, and you'd get out of the, how can you possibly discuss all of this in 90-minute trap? So these are just some ideas for these what ifs. I should point out that we have not implemented any of these. We are working on them. And once again, it also shows my preoccupation. I tend to like technology-driven ideas and solutions to things, but I think really if we start using some of these technologies, that might be even further in the future of case studies. Okay, back to you, Andrew.
John, thanks very much, and some great issues and ideas there. I'm going to go in a minute to, I think, some of the sort of the themes, particularly around technology, that we've all been touching on. But first, I mean, I just a high-level question, and maybe I'll come to you, JD, for your experience teaching on cases. But there is this sort of, at least, perception that I hear sometimes talking to a lot of schools, particularly in Asia and Africa, that an awful lot of case studies are still very Western focused. They tend to focus on men, white men, chief executives. You don't often hear the voice of women, of minorities, of the trade union perspective, of alternative, societal actors. And so they're sometimes limited in their capacity to be rolled out to be relevant in other parts of the world. Is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to sort of approach the, maybe bring in a new dimension to the topic of, case study teaching, which is the student perspective, right? When you teach a case, you're assuming that the students have a certain level of maturity in being able to read the case, understand the facts, and then come into the classroom with the ability to be able to analyze that case and discuss that with their peers and with their students. Right? One of the difficulties that we have when we teach cases in India or in Asia is that our student cohort and the mix of students that we get in the classroom is very different, perhaps, than what we get in the West. Think of this as a situation where if I'm training, let me take a consulting example. If I'm training students who are currently at the level of an analyst or an associate and you want to make them engagement managers, versus a situation where perhaps you are already at a high level, partner level, and you want to get them into a C-suite executive. The kind of teaching pedagogy that you would sort of adapt in your classroom would be very different depending on the student cohort that you have. And I think in some level, this is a problem that we faced in India and perhaps more so in Asia as well, is that the cases that we read are geared towards a student audience that is more mature in its understanding as compared to the cohort that we receive here. And that is going to sort of tie in with the point that you just made, right? Because these cases have been written for a very different set of students. And so if you want to be able to do this and spread the case study method across a different part of the world, your ability to be able to engage with the students is going to be better if the cases are conformed to their sort of thinking, right? You need to be able to write cases that bring in that particular flavor. The other, I think, point that we need to make when we think about this is that our students are very STEM focused, right? So most of the students that we get in our cohort are not as diverse in terms of the experience that you would get at a Harvard or at a Yale. We get very STEM focused students. And there is a proliferation now of STEM based MBAs as well, and you're sort of seeing that over and over again. And so writing cases for STEM subjects is hard, right? I cannot teach difficult concepts in decision sciences or in a quantitative subject by pitching it either as a skill or a judgment, simply because, if you really think of students as actors, like Jan mentioned, these actors have to be talented, and the director has to be good enough to be able to create a good movie. It's harder to do that when there's a lot of facts and figures and numbers that are required in the case. And so I think there are different perspectives that we need to sort of look at when we analyze the future of the case study as a pedagogical tool in India and Africa. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Maybe Vijay, I could just come back to you, because obviously Harvard has, I think by far, doesn't it, the largest library of cases around the world that are picked up. I mean, how are you responding to that kind of demand for both different backgrounds and experience levels, but also geographies and different sorts of expertises and perspectives in cases?
Yeah, yes, Andrew, I've been here 27 years and I've seen a huge shift in the kind of cases that we write over this 27 years, right? When I started, majority of our cases were based in North America. Today, a majority of our cases are based outside North America. They are much more international. Last year, when Black Lives Matter movement was to the fore in the US, we did a lot of soul searching, and we said, how come our protagonists in the case don't reflect the diversity of our student body? So we made an active commitment to have more diverse protagonists. And if you just look at it over the last 3 or 4 years, again, you start seeing a sea change where there is a commitment on the part of the faculty to have the cases protagonists. Like it might still be an NPV calculation. It might just be a CFO. It just happens to be that the CFO is a woman of color, right? And why is that important? I think it's important for the students to see people that look like themselves in leadership roles, even though the content that they got was like, how to create a cash flow statement for the day. And I think there is a lot more of that happening, more awareness, and also more changes in practice. There is a lot more diversity. This is a long journey. I think we have taken only the first steps, but I think the commitment to do that is there.
Thanks. I want to shift to a second question or group of questions around technology. I see actually there's a question here, Vijay, from a former student of yours, but maybe let me ask it to John in the first instance, but about how Google, for example, is sort of completely disrupting. Now that we're going so much more online, students can go out and precisely kind of use so many more sources and find the answer, or at least what actually happened in named, non-anonymized examples. And that really can take the fizz and the excitement out of a classroom discussion. John, does that resonate with you?
Well, first of all, in doing raw cases, one of the other things that we discovered was that it's very hard to do a raw case on a situation that is not current at the time that we're writing the case. Because when you're doing a video, you can't say to the CEO, pretend you're back 3 years ago when you were making this decision and before you knew what happened. So raw cases tend to be in the moment, at least in their first teaching. The ability to go out and Google means that you cannot easily stylize facts anymore, because there are people who will go out there and immediately look at things. There is also, and this is a problem for all of us, is that there are case analyses floating out there. Students will go to sites, I see my name popping up all the time, read an analysis of Jan's case on this. And in fact, we had to stop using an HBS case that we were using here because the analysis that students were picking up on was wrong. And the faculty ended up having to kind of argue with the student and saying, but they were going, no, but we got this. And so we rather than get into that argument, we dropped the case entirely. So that does add a thing, add a bit of a little bit of a layer of complexity. But remember, a student, and we can track this when looking at raw cases, does about 100 minutes of preparation for a case. So having read the case, having gone through the exhibits, having done this thing, there isn't a whole lot more time to hit the Google and start reading other things in addition to what's out there. Oh, I'd like to make one quick point to a previous question,
sure,
which is there is a practical reason that a lot of the cases are done about CEOs. is it's very hard to get cases about frontline managers because the frontline manager has to go to their CEO in order to get approval to talk to Yale or Harvard or other places. So inevitably, the CEO always gets involved, and it's really hard for them to get clearance levels. Whereas when I'm dealing with the CEO, it's pre-cleared. They're fine with the case study. They want it to be written. So there's a little bit of a practical obstacle to writing cases about frontline supervisors and things like that.
I'm going to come to you in a minute, Srivardhini, but actually picking up, John, on that point with you, VG, I see there's been a couple of questions about this issue of how often cases tend to project a rather positive view, and people have talked here about company approval, and we know, famous notorious examples in the past, rather more positive than negative cases on certain companies that then collapse, where there are issues of fraud and so on. How do you tackle that? I mean, can we ever provide truly critical perspectives through cases when normally they do rely on the cooperation and the approval of the key organizations involved?
I think there is a true limitation, and the first step is to acknowledge that in the classroom, that this is not a success story, this is not a best practice, and critical views are just as important. And likewise, when I write the case, I tell the protagonist, I tell the company, don't come here looking at this as a way to celebrate your success. Come to my class, be willing to write a case if you are willing to learn from this experience. I wrote a case in the Delhi Metro in India, and we started the case with an accident where 7 lives were lost. And I explained to the CEO at the time why this was important, and he was on board. So I think being aware of this problem, that you can fall in love with the protagonist and with the company, and therefore get biased as the case writer, is your first level of defense. That said, I think we can learn even more from disasters. And unfortunately, they end up being like library cases. My workaround is to write a library case and then mail it to the company and say, here's what I wrote based on public domain information. Do you have any reactions? And if they reply to you or call you in for interview, that then becomes the B case. Okay, so there's a little bit of tricking that you can do to get these failure cases written up as well.
Srivardhini, you might want to come back on that, but I also wanted to go back to this earlier point on the classroom. And you mentioned in your presentation the issue, for example, of more timid students. There's a broader question here from those attending, sort of about how do you actually, or what advice, and I'll come to others as well on this as well, what advice can you give on how to assess student performance when you have these different personality types, when some may have spoken before others? Does technology provide new opportunities? Are there real challenges in doing the sort of continuous assessment with case method?
Yeah, I think, yes, there are different learning styles, there are different personalities in the classroom, and we have to be very aware of that. A lot of times we have a fair bit of weightage on class participation, but one of the things that we need to do is provide an opportunity for students who are probably not comfortable speaking up in the classroom also to contribute in some other manner. So I think online forums is a great way. Of course, that means that the instructor has to moderate it, or a teaching assistant has to moderate. It does create more overheads. But I think if you are grading students on the basis of class participation, from the view of fairness, you must provide an alternative way of participating, something that doesn't require people to only participate by voicing their view in the classroom. Another couple of tactics one could use is, if you know a certain set of students are not participating, they're not comfortable, maybe you send an email ahead of the class saying that, I'm going to ask you something, ask you to talk about this or that or the other. I mean, it's a warm call. You kind of give them a little bit of heads up so that they think about it, they come more prepared. And I think it also helps in their own development, right? They do pick up some of those skills. And I think technology is definitely helping, because a lot of students who might feel otherwise hesitant to speak up in class are now obviously more comfortable putting in their views on the chat window, for instance, right? Or they might be quite comfortable discussing in smaller breakout rooms, which also we used to do earlier in the physical world, but this also allows for that to happen. So I think the important thing is to just be aware that there are differences, and take those steps consciously to ensure that we have a more inclusive environment.
Anybody else want to come back with a tip on evaluating students at different levels of confidence and so on, using cases? John, maybe, or no? A challenge. Vijay, then, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so more than a tip on evaluating, I would say putting them in small groups before the case discussion, having them discuss in small groups, because very often the students are lacking the confidence. And if they try the idea out in a group of 5 people and the heavens don't fall, they're much more willing to go out on a limb and take chances in the real classroom. So giving them that opportunity, I taught extensively in East Asia, where this is particularly a big problem, where people culturally are not used to speaking unless they're spoken to. And it's viewed like not deferential to speak up and articulate your point of view when there is this power equation where the professor is put on a pedestal. So to change that, what I found very helpful is to put them in small groups ahead of the class, and then when they come to class, and sort of also explain the learning contract to them, that this is like everyone contributes equally. I'm there with the chalk only to write on the board. You only take what you get from each other. I found that it helps. And by the end of the week, usually I'm teaching 1-week programs, the introverts have made huge progress just in 1 week's time. So I think it's possible. It's a limitation, but it's something that can be mitigated. And Srivardhini had the right points on how to do that.
I will just add a bit of color as someone who has sat in an HBS classroom and answered a cold call. I've spoken a lot. I don't think there are very few times I have been as nervous as doing an opening on a finance case as I was in the HBS classroom. I had the analysis all in front of me, and I was still like, where am I going on this? What am I doing on this? And so, and it wasn't the professor, by the way, I was afraid of. It's the judgment of the 90 other students. I mean, that was what made me nervous.
It was
preparing.
Please go ahead.
Bring in the point of quantity versus quality as well, right? So if you have a very large classroom, and in some instances there are universities where the MBA classroom can be as much as 200 students, it becomes harder to handle the case, right? I mean, so it's based on the assumption that you have a small elite group of students who can contribute to the case discussion. And if that volume of students sort of crosses a certain threshold, then the case teaching method starts to sort of run into a bit of issues. And I think there's that quantity versus quality debate, which I think we should be aware of as an instructor.
And let's just build on the points around technology in 2 ways. So one, and we heard it from Srivardhini a little bit about, for example, the scope with chat and Zoom in the discussion. But what about also on the provision? I see there's a number of arguments here around, for example, integrating more multimedia content, doing more virtual reality style of cases and so on. Is there a lot of scope? What are people's impressions and thoughts around that? Vijay, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think so. You have to embrace technology, and technology is moving faster, right? So before Zoom, I may do a poll in the class, raise your hands. Now it's like word clouds. It's just so fancy what you can do just during the pandemic, how much technology has changed to facilitate the case method. Our CTO had a great relationship with the CTO of Zoom. So whenever we put in requests, 3-4 months later, Zoom would respond with some feature additions. So I think Zoom and other companies as well have been super responsive to that. So multimedia cases were already in vogue for the last 5-10 years, but I think the pandemic has just made that much bigger. So I can imagine a scenario in the future where this might sound crazy now, but 10, 20 years from now, where we put on virtual glasses and we go a Toyota production factory tour and we can examine things, we can ask questions, etc. And then we come back to a classroom and say, what did we learn? So I think the technology is going to make like great changes for the better and be a good complement to the case method.
John, it must be relevant for you with your raw approach, as it were, as well, to draw on different resources.
And one just the short point I'd like to make on this is that there needs to be a marriage. A lot of good stuff is coming in on the people doing MOOCs, online learning. And then that seems divorced from the residence learning. So we have to get these two communities, often existing in the same school, I know in my school, and get them sharing best practices so that some of the innovations that come in on the online side of teaching also build into the classroom side. And we don't see enough of that, I think, right now. And the pandemic has hurried that because we've all been kind of teaching virtually and in hybrid mode. But there needs to be more integration, and there has to be less of this paradigm of MOOCs, evaluating these interactive platforms I've talked about. They're all lecture, take a quiz, lecture, take a quiz, rather than solve and build in the way I want to do it. They're all in the context of a whole course rather than a module that I could use. So the technology is moving, but sometimes it isn't moving in the direction that we need.
And John, just picking up on that, but given you use these variety of different sources, I mean, it's always struck me that, I mean, dare I say it, the FT, but also other media, business media, could be, more up-to-date instant snapshots to at least embellish core, deeper case tools and so on. Do you think there's value in doing more of that?
We have FT articles linked to in our raw cases, so there you go.
That's good.
Yeah, there is value in linking. They provide useful perspectives. Sometimes you can play off them. You can play off their failures easier than the company's failure. A number of our finance classes play off the failures of analysts' reports that are really off base. And then we come back and say, well, why were the analysts pushing the stock so much? And what weren't they seeing about the industry and so on? So yeah, there's interesting stuff. You can take it both for the information and then also because they provide an additional perspective. Someone thinks this is like the worst idea ever. I mean, when Netflix started streaming, there were a lot of articles about how can Netflix stream. They know nothing about anything except putting DVDs into envelopes. And looking at that article in light of what's happened to Netflix since then is actually very interesting.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to briefly go around just thinking about the issue of the balance of case teaching versus other forms of pedagogy. I mean, VG, if I recall, Harvard had in their typical MBA 500 or so cases that students get through. I mean, it's a massive proportion, presumably, of total time, is it? I mean, are there any thoughts about what the right balance should be going forwards?
No, you're probably right. It's probably even more than 500, but we use the case to very broadly. If it's a simulation, we still call it a case, right? So even if it's an exercise, we slap the name of a company on it, and it's almost become a proxy for a session when we say a case. But I think we have used a lot more field method in the last the previous dean, like the last 10 years, he introduced this. We send our student teams out all over the world. They work on projects. So the field method, particularly immersive field courses that last the full semester, we have been using that for, but case method is still probably 80% of what we do.
Sorry, JD, I mean, any thoughts about what the ideal mix should be of case versus other forms of pedagogy for you?
Is it better to be taught 100% of the material, or is it better to learn 60% on your own? I think that's really the key question here, right? When you lecture and you listen to a lecture, I get 100% of the material spoon-fed into my mouth. Whereas if I sit in a case study discussion, I may learn only 60% or 70% of the case, but I learn it on my own and I learn it from my peers. It is our ability to pick which one it is. And I think the way it's going, If you have a large volume class, it's lecturing. If you have a small elite class, I think it's case. I think that's sort of where I draw that distinction.
So we've really got about literally just about a minute left. I'd like to go around to each of you literally in a sentence. I think if you each had one key tip on how to best use and teach using the case method for colleagues watching, what would it be? John?
When beginning case teachers come to me, I always tell them, don't worry about teaching so much. Imagine that this is the dilemma in front of a business that you are running and that you are discussing, and you're running a business meeting, so that you are trying to get to the heart of the dilemma.
JD?
I'm going to say accept being embarrassed once in a while, even as a faculty member. I've had it once or twice, and I've sort of grown from that experience.
Vijay?
I would say be extremely curious about what your students have to say. If you go in with, this is what I want them to say, and they're trying to guess what you have in mind, it's not a good learning exercise. Whereas if you go in saying like, hey, what would you do? I'm so curious. I think the students will have more fun and they'll learn a lot more.
And Srivedini?
Yeah, to me, case teaching is about flexibility in the classroom. I think as instructors, we need to be extremely flexible, see how the conversation goes, go with the flow. And I think there's a lot of information out there. Just as the students know what happened in the case, we as instructors also, have a lot of information at our disposal, which we can creatively bring in to steer the discussion. Flexibility.
So thank you all very much indeed. I'm sorry we've run out of time. I see some other great questions, which unfortunately we haven't had time to get to, including one about perhaps we need cases in teaching itself, an interesting thought. But best of luck as we move into the coming academic period in all your work. It sounds like the case study certainly still has a fundamental role to play, albeit in various different forms of application and interpretation and content. And long may the debate and the anniversaries for the case method continue. So thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, let me also take this opportunity to thank Andrew, Jan, Vijay, Srivardhani, JD for an excellent panel discussion. And also thank you, Professor Jose, Chitra, and the rest of the CTL team for organizing this. Thanks a lot. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.